As you already know, After Effects is powerful, but it's about to get so much better. In After Effects, we have the ability to create both 2D and 3D elements. We'll start off by working with the classic After Effects 3D renderer. This feature provides a number of tools and settings which allow you to change the After Effects workspace from 2D to 3D. You can create and customize virtual lights and cameras and make some really interesting and dynamic results. Understanding how to use these features can really help you to level up your motion graphics. In order to get started with 3D, first you have to have 3D elements with which to work on. It's important to realize that when we're working in the classic 3D render workspace, we're simply manipulating 2D layers in 3D space. There's actually no 3D objects with any kind of extrusion. We will call these layers 3D, but they're still technically flat images. What we're doing is we're actually adding the third dimension, the Z space, to our project. Let's take a look at how this works. In order to get started working with 3D, you need to specify that a layer is a 3D element. So right here, I have 3 moons. The first one is in the middle, the second one's on the left, and the third one's on the right. I'm going to select the first moon. In order to invoke the 3D, we need to go to the 3D layer switch in the timeline and turn it on. Conversely, you can also go to Layer, 3D Layer. Once we do this, you'll notice that this layer now has an icon that sits underneath this 3D column. You can also create a 3D element by simply toggling that 3D column on for that particular layer. Once you've made a layer 3D, you're going to see that you have a new icon that appears over that layer. If we open up that layer and check out our properties, we now have new additional properties. So prior to this, we only had the transform properties. And you can see I have anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity. If we go ahead and open up our transform for our 3D moon, you can see that we have quite a few more options. Under anchor point, we actually have 3 axes instead of 2. For position, we have 3 axes. For scaling, for orientation, and then we have the ability to rotate an element in X, Y, and Z rotation. If I go ahead and make changes in these directions, you will see that the element is going to change in some non-conventional ways. So if I rotate my element in the Y space, you can see that my middle moon is actually getting flatter. It's as if I'm spinning this along the vertical axes. I'm just going to simply click undo to undo that. The X rotation is going to make the element spin on the horizontal axes or the X axes. Once again, I'll hit undo. In addition to these new transform properties, we also have a grayed out option, the geometry options, and these will not work with the classic 3D renderer. We'll go ahead and we'll be looking at these in a future exercise. In addition, we have material options. When you make an element a 3D element, that element has the ability to react to light layers. So we have different ways in which we can control how the element is going to accept lights and shadows. Once again, we'll be working with that a little bit later on. For now, let's just concentrate on how we can work in the 3D space. It also is worth mentioning that if we turn off the 3D switch, we will lose all of those different options. If you want to retain those options, you have to keep that layer as a 3D layer. As you already saw, we get this little icon that appears on top of our element. This is how we can also move and position our element in 3D space. The red indicates the x-axis, the green indicates the y-axis, and the blue indicates the z-axis. And you can see when I hover over these different spaces, I will get a little tooltip that pops up and shows me which axes we are talking about. I personally find it easier to rotate my elements for the most part using the timeline modifications. What I'm going to do to start off with is I'm going to change my element's position in 3D space. As you would expect, if I manipulate the X position, it is going to move horizontally across my composition. If I manipulate it in Y space, it's going to move up and down within my composition. Z space is going to move it in the Z dimension. If I make this a negative number, you can see that the moon appears to be getting smaller. We're actually not changing the size of the moon, but we're moving the moon farther away from our particular position. In order to see this better, as soon as you make an element a 3D element, you're going to have some new options that will appear in the lower right-hand portion of your composition window. One of the things you may want to do is turn on Draft 3D. This is going to improve performance as you are working on your composition and animating. Generally, I will leave this turned on. This right here is going to control the 3D renderer. For right now, we'll stick with Classic 3D. Over here on the right, we have a way to change our camera view. Currently, I'm viewing the active camera. But if we use this drop-down menu, you can see how I have different camera settings that I can look at. So if I view my composition from the top, we're going to get a completely different view of our composition. And really, it doesn't look like we see anything. And that's because we've moved our moon out in the Z index and we're not currently seeing it on the screen. But if we look at it from the right view, you can see that here's my element, and currently it's appearing a little bit off the viewable space of my composition. I'm going to change the camera view to a custom view. This will allow us to actually see the element in 3D space. You'll notice how I currently only see the moon that we've made a 3D element. My other two moons do not appear in this view. This view is reserved for elements that are 3D. In addition to being able to change your views, you can also change your view settings so that you can have multiple views. So if I change to 2 views, you can see that I have 2 settings. One is the active camera, which is the default. The other one currently is also default. These little blue triangles indicate that this is the selected view. If I go ahead and change my view to our custom view 1, now we can see what our scene looks like from this 3D view. If I go ahead and I move the Z position of my moon from the 3D view, the view on the right, you can see how the moon is moving on the Z axis and either coming closer or farther away from us. In the default view, the active camera view, the moon simply gets smaller when it's farther away or bigger when it becomes closer. If we go ahead and make these other 2 elements 3D elements by simply clicking in the 3D space, you can now see that this is the default location for our elements. As we manipulate the first moon along the Z axis, it is going to move in this Z direction or in the 3D space. If we go ahead and access Moon 3 and we go into Transform and we position it in the Z space, you can see that the moon may appear larger if it's closer to us or farther away if it extends back in the Z space. If we manipulate one of these other elements, and I'm going to drag this to the left, you can see that this element, the pink moon, appears in front of the other elements. If we look at it in our 3D view, you can see how this moon is clearly in front of the other 2 elements. If I reset the Transform Z property for position back to 0, now you can see that both the blue and the pink moon are in the same location. In this 3D view, you can see how they're kind of overlapping, and this is because they currently reside in the exact same 3D space. So sometimes when your elements are going to exist in the same space, you may have some weirdness that occurs. If we rotate our element along the Y space, you can see how I'm tilting the element, and it will come in front of or go behind the teal moon. And that's because it is close enough to interact with that particular element. You can see that it doesn't look like it's affecting the white moon, and that's because this moon is too far back. If we grab the white moon and bring it closer, and now we go back to rotating our pink moon, it potentially could hit or circle around the white moon. You can see that my white moon is still a little too far away, so I need to bring it a little bit closer. At some point, these two elements have the potential to interact or overlap if they are sharing the same sort of 3D space. Hopefully this gave you a quick overview about how to turn an element into a 3D element and how to change our views and work within the 3D spaces. We'll be working a lot more with 3D so that you can start to see some of the potential that you'll have available to you by using the 3D space.